Part two, here we go. We're shifting gears now from sound systems to visual culture, and we're in for a treat, as you can see. I'm going to say a little bit about the guests, and we'll get right into it. So Vince Aletti here is a writer and curator based in New York City. His writings on music and photography have been published widely. Between 1973 and 1978, Aletti wrote a weekly column on the emerging disco scene for Record World magazine. And between 1987 and 2005, he was the art editor and photography critic for The Village Voice. His writings have also appeared in The New Yorker, Art Forum, Vogue Italia, among many other publications. He also worked for Tower Records, so he has that record store experience too. And upstairs in the exhibition, he made a playlist that's in the Teenage Engineering did the exhibition design, and you'll see a beautiful blue couch with playlists that you can actually like spin and touch and hear. There's a disco playlist, so check that out. Next, Love Injection, variously known as a publication, a radio show, a DJ partnership, production duo, and record label. Paul Raffaele and Barbie Bertisch not only do all of that, but they bring people together, young and old, to celebrate the culture of NYC nightlife through their fanzine and frequent gatherings, which are critical to carrying forward the history and importance of the interpersonal connection, thread, and relationships that develop on the dance floor and from music in general. Thank you for that. They also have record store experience. They are graphic designers, label. It's like they're so perfect for this talk. And lastly, Matthew Higgs, who will be moderating, is an artist and the director and chief curator of White Columns New York. Over the past 3 decades, Higgs has organized more than 250 exhibitions and projects with artists, including projects with Vince, Paul, and Barbie. In 2006, Higgs launched the vinyl-only record label, The Sound of White Columns, releasing new and archival records by artist-musicians. Okay, so at that, it's my honor to turn things over to you all. You probably actually all saw my script. I didn't even realize, but we have this amazing thing called Elmo, which is actually like an antique. But we found it upstairs in the tech closet because they're going to do a little show and tell. So I'll hand it over. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's great to see so many people. And thanks to the previous panelists, which was really interesting. I think it might come up in our conversation, but this sort of intersection between the analog and the digital worlds that we all straddle may raise itself in our conversation. Yeah, my name is Matthew Higgs, and I think one of the interesting things about today's panel is there are sort of 3 different generations in terms of relation to the larger subject at hand. Vince obviously was a critical figure in New York's underground dance scene in the late 60s through the 70s, and through his weekly column, Record File, essentially created the narrative Disco File, sorry. He created the narrative that, you know, we all follow. Myself, I grew up in Manchester in England in the late 70s and early 1980s. I used to write a music fanzine. I became directly interested in art through my interest in music. And then more recently in this century, Paul and Barbie, through Love Injection and their many other projects, have continued to sort of expand the culture. But I think in a very different ways, all 3 of us have sort of quite strong biographical relationships with the visual matter, the sort of material culture of music. And I think if you've had a chance to see the exhibition upstairs yet, which is kind of overwhelming and amazing, it's clear that the subject's too big for one panel discussion. But I think what's interesting about the panelists today is that we're sort of, in many ways, focused on one area of music culture and the material culture that accompanies it, which is around dance music and dance music culture. Certainly a lot of our histories are sort of embedded in those kind of fields or those areas of the visualization or the visual manifestation of music. So I thought really, because we have this amazing analog device, is it analog or is it digital analog, to do a show and tell, that I thought I might invite our panelists to really just sort of give a kind of sort of biographical introduction to themselves through some of the materials that they've brought in. And perhaps we might start with you, Vince.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Since my material is probably among the older things that we've gathered here. I thought I would start with just thinking about the records that I saw when I was growing up, and how radically they changed over, a very short period of time. Perry Como was probably one of the first things I remember hearing on the radio. But pretty quickly, it was Frankie Avalon, Little Richard, and Fabian. I mean, this really weird range of masculine ways of looking at the performer over a very short period of time, and how radically that changed, and how that led into so much more. But I'm sort of jumping way ahead after that, and wanted to just sort of show a range of what I think defined music culture in a lot of ways. That was such an intersection for really the longest time between the way you saw a record company, a record cover, and the way you thought about a record, something that, attracted you for all different reasons, but something that became an important aspect of why you were involved in this culture. And the Rolling Stones, I think, were some of the best in terms of using really interesting artists to work with, and always had really great record covers, including, of course, the famous zipper pants cover. What was that record? So yes, thank you. Which I'm sorry I didn't bring, but I just brought 45s, I decided. I think for many of us growing up especially, and throughout the time that we were involved in music, it's so much about the cover, the image, as well as it lasts beyond the music that we're hearing at that moment. But it's also, I think something's really engaging for a long period of time. I had to include Madonna. And then, and the Smiths, who had the best series of especially 12-inch single covers that were very conceptual in a lot of ways, that sort of set a sense of not exactly who they were. They never had their own image on the covers. They always had pictures of things that they related to and that we then had to figure out, relate to. And this I brought, this Count Basie, because Andy Warhol did a ton of great covers for all kinds of, mostly jazz, but all kinds of records in his lifetime. And this is one of the rarer ones, Count Basie. And then I wanted to end with this Basquiat cover. Okay. Is it working? Okay. Thank you. This is, Basquiat did two famous covers. This is the less famous, but I think also a great one. And the idea that art and music were so intimately involved throughout the whole process, throughout the history of music, and especially to see that represented upstairs. There are there's a lot of great album covers, and each one of them, I think for a lot of us, sparks another feeling of the intimacy of that music, that what that means to us, and how much that lasts throughout our experience. And I'm sure there will be more. Thank you.
just invite Barbie and Paul to do a show and tell, and then we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, this is very
Thank you, Vince.
unplanned, but I think Vince showing the Basquiat artwork, a good segue there is to show some of the ways these giants of the art world as we know them have, of course, were once part of these communities and contributed to them, and were kind of inextricably linked to the visual culture that we now think back and remember them by. Mm-hmm. Vince, did you go to this party?
Yes.
Can you tell us about it?
No. They all kind of blend together. But of course I also had that handkerchief. There were so many, all the Keith Haring things from Paradise Garage are amazing. Mm-hmm. And his involvement with that was so real. It wasn't something you just came in and did and walked away from. He designed a lot of the murals at the garage. And so it was really this intimate sense of his presence through his art.
I think a lot of the ways that, I guess, Paul and I's relationship as sort of young clubbers and then growing into being DJs, designers, etc. A lot of the way that we inextricably just link music with visual, because even though today we experience a lot of like party invitations through the internet, all of this stuff, as we are seeing here, is printed. That was the way to communicate. That was the way to find out where you could see other people. That is Vince, actually, with Mel Sharon at the party. But I think there's just, a lot of the stuff that we're showing is, I would say, like quite rare and ephemeral and what have you. It is part of the fabric of New York dance culture. And I think a lot of us today, including some of the folks that were on the panel earlier, like operate, that's a Keith Haring right there, operate on the same principles, like the visual representation of what we value and live with and inhabit and what the music represents to us so often makes its way to the party flyers or the way that the photography is captured sometimes, if anything at the party. Any keepsakes, such as the handkerchiefs or the T-shirts and so on. So it's almost, in a way, it's just sort of archaeological work. It feels like cultural archaeological work, but also preservation. And it's just kind of an incredible way to live on through the stories and, through the lived experience.
I just want to touch on, on the topic of preservation. The person that preserved all this was named Judy Russell. She was a part of the music industry, touched many facets of it. I think before anything else, she was a garage head, a lover of music, a friend of Larry. She was also a clerk at Vinyl Mania record store, which was right around the corner from the garage. And there have been a lot of stories told where, Larry would play a record at the garage and people would line up the next morning to find out what the record was. They'd sing the songs to the clerks. And so she's passed on around 10 years ago now, but she struck up a relationship with a good friend of ours, Ben Goldfarb, DJ Scribe. And at the time they met, Ben opened up a record store in a vacant storefront down below her apartment. And she was going through a tough time and was selling things. So she came in, saw some records, some garage records on the wall, and said, "Hey, would you be interested in buying some things I have?" And he said, "Yeah, but let's talk," And they became really good friends, and Ben ended up preserving a lot of this stuff before ultimately Judy got evicted from that place. And so their relationship was really special at the end because Ben, hired her to, catalog his Discogs collection, work doors at his parties and parties at large in the community, and together they they preserve this stuff, and it's on loan to us for a few years now since our exhibition at White Columns in 2017.
You want to just briefly show Love Injection, the magazine?
Yes, and so kind of how all this stuff ties to what we do today, because we are aware that we are talking about sort of telling the stories of the past as well and recontextualizing them and giving them new life and joining the dot between the dots of the stories. Paul and I started a fanzine back in 2015 called Love Injection, which is a record by Trussell, sort of one of the great records of the era. And Paul is a graphic designer by trade. And he can kind of tell you a little bit about his experience and sort of the inception of the story, but you could see how there is this idea of like trying to capture the essence of what that looks like, what this club culture looks like today. It is not really done incredibly intentionally, thinking that this will be archived. This is just a reflection of our times and what we're living in. Do we want to talk a little bit about the covers? I should mention Corey. So we've been an issue. We're kind of on a paternity break at the moment. we had a baby somewhat recently, but it started 2015. It had been monthly for a really long time, free as well. A short run of about between 1,000 and 3,000 units, free at all New York City record stores. Just maybe show Love Injection. And independently printed and sort of backed, supported sometimes by different, selling advertisement to clubs and other entities here who wanted to support it, but has been operated by us since us too, and that's probably why it's still on a break. But issue 70 was the latest issue that we released, but here's this kind of a smattering of some of the issues in our archive. One thing to note is that we made it a point, you could buy PDFs online, but it actually is not available in like a kind of get a link and share the photo. It's always sort of meant to give you a break from the digital noise, or at least that's the way that it was founded upon, and I believe the way that it still remains.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, as the designer, of that portion of it, for me, music and design's always been sort of connected. I started DJing the same year I started messing around with Photoshop, both self-taught. And, you know, Matthew on an internal call, we were discussing things called the magazine self-referential, and I think that's really, we're self-aware of how it looks and the lineage that it comes out of. And it definitely was inspired by very specific things. And the things that it was inspired by, I'm now realizing were inspired by things that were, you know, that happened sooner than that. So I didn't know about the Vinyl Maniac, you know, back when I started the magazine, but through Judy's archive, we found this publication that was published out of the Vinyl Mania record store that was basically promoting the music and the artists that were bubbling up at the time. And if you look at like all the covers, these are some of the more recent covers that were in color, but like some of the first issues actually really looked and felt like this without even me realizing it. The first Madonna interview ever was in the Vinyl Maniac. A Larry, you know, a rare Larry Levan interview. This I did know about. It was sort of Club Kid era, so think Limelight, Michael Alec, Party Monster era, early 90s, you know. Think of those folks, of what you will and stuff, but this was a really interesting snapshot of what was going on at that time and the characters that were running amok. But yeah, I mean, the magazine was always supposed to sort of look back while you know, being a snapshot of what was going on currently. It's also very inspired by the Red Bull Music Academy Daily Note, which some friends in this room were responsible for making. Shout out to Peter. You know, when I first saw that given out at the subway stops in 2015-ish, you know, when the festival was still active, I felt very seen. Not that I was in it, but my friends were. So it was like an interview about with Grace Jones and sort of my friends Josh and Dave from Fixed, and it was just like from one page to the other. And I think previous to that, it was all the dance music press felt very Europe look. The gaze was towards Europe on Resident Advisor and Accelerator and some of the other online magazines. So I felt like when the festival left and the Daily Note stopped being distributed, I felt, oh, this is interesting. This is like a really interesting jumping off point to use as inspiration and try to take my own hand at it, being that I could pretty much put together an issue myself.
Yeah. And so we met very shortly after he was having the idea of starting this magazine, and I was starting to DJ at the time. He had already been DJing for quite a while. I said, why don't we just do a launch party for the first issue, and then our kind of relationship evolved from there. It's this sort of early black and white first logo. And yeah, it's, like I mentioned, 70 issues in, and then things kind of ballooned from there. Sort of started a radio show weekly on the Lot Radio as a result. Did a bunch of radio for other places. Now we have a record label and sort of interacting with art and visual in a very sort of commercial way, in the way that the fanzine perhaps never had to feel that commercial to begin with. It's just sort of purely,
Thanks, guys. I think one of the things that interests me in my work as a curator of contemporary art is and it's certainly a development in this century, and it's been more accelerated, I'd say, in the last 10 years, probably stimulated by social media and the greater access we have to previously obscure or lost information, is the sort of process of historicization of something that was fundamentally ephemeral. And you see that upstairs in the exhibition today. There's like the holy grail of flyers, which is a DJ Kool Herc handwritten party invite from 1974. I think he and his sister wrote them on index cards. But also, I think, in relation to the field of disco and dance music culture, it really, in a same way, begins with sort of the books. Last Night a DJ Saved My Life, which I think for a lot of people was revelatory, and then Tim Lawrence's books. And for me, certainly running a contemporary art space in New York, knowing Vince as a writer about photography, contemporary visual culture, but also knowing of his earlier history with dance music culture. In 2008, at White Columns, I organized an exhibition with Vince called Male, which was an exhibition of works from Vince's private collection, which were all images of men, which relates to the very earliest material he just presented here, some of those ideas of masculinity that circulated in culture. But when I was at Vince's house to curate that exhibition, he had a huge stack of vintage magazines from Record World magazine, which was a trade magazine like Billboard. And I just simply said to Vince, oh, what's that? And he told me that he wrote a weekly column on disco from late 1973 through to 1978.
Yes.
Sort of from the emergence of sort of disco music from an underground phenomenon into a mainstream culture. And Vince chronicled it every single week. And it's clearly the definitive account of this music's movement from being a subcultural idea into a mainstream idea. So I simply asked Vince if we could reprint it. And we printed it in this Xerox binder format. And we made an edition of 100 copies in 2008. And we sold them for $50. We lost money on every one. And they sold very slowly. They sold steadily, but they sold very slowly. And I was telling these guys before, the highlight of selling them was the day David Mancuso came to White Columns to buy his copy. And Mancuso's charts are in the book too. And I think for me what was interesting with this, and it especially relates then to Love Injection, I did a show with Paul and Barbie at White Columns on the second anniversary of Love Injection, which would be 2017. And I really gravitated to the idea that they were working with a printed fanzine, which clearly spoke back to early fanzine culture, my experience in sort of the post-punk era, information circulated through independent zine culture, but also this commitment on their part to doing this in a digital culture, when in many ways it wasn't necessary to publish. In fact, it was the kind of hardship to publish. But to both of you, all three of you, this idea of the historical as it relates to the culture, because Vince, you were documenting it in real time, and then people on the week became aware of the disco file, which became a formal book, the guys that did Last Night a DJ Saved My Life turned it into a trade paperback, which is very successful. But up until that point, this was kind of a lost history. And now we're in a decade, 15 years later, we're almost like saturated with these histories. There's an abundance of histories. It's obviously a great thing. But
Yeah,
did you feel like you were writing history when you were writing it?
no, not at all. I mean, but I always had the sense that this was important. But I mean, if only because I was writing essentially for the DJs. I didn't care about most of the readers of Record World were rack jobbers and people at the business of putting out music. But I was writing for the DJs because those are the people I knew would actually read and care about what I was writing, and hopefully, take some advice from me. But also, I was constantly, every week, speaking to them, and so I was mostly taking advice from them, finding out what they were playing, what they were really playing, and putting out charts every week. So that I felt like I was following something important to me and important to a relatively small culture that obviously during that time completely boomed to the point of kind of taking over and really, and by the time I was moved on from writing the column, I was then working at a label putting out disco records.
I think one of the interesting things that we discussed leading up to today's conversation is how, in relation to the Art of Noise exhibition, where there's often like an abundance of visual stimulation in design as it relates to music, within early dance music culture, then later into the 70s and into the early 80s with DJ culture, there's almost an absence of design. That very rarely do you see the artist, because it wasn't an artist-driven culture, it was a producer-driven culture.
Right, right.
The key labels, TK, Prelude, Salsoul, and so on, all had generic record sleeves. So they were really not creating an image of an identity of an individual. They were creating an image of, or almost like a sensibility that the consumer would gravitate to. They'd see a TK
a
disco
particular
bag,
style.
and they knew that they could rely on that for the kind of things they were interested
Because
in.
most of the time they were not putting out albums, they were putting out 12-inch singles. It took a while for a label to actually get enough music from a particular performer to put out a record, an album. So those were in a sense rare, and the 12-inch single sleeve was the more, typical generic format.
And you see this, migrate between what became disco music, and you see it also in Jamaican music, the use of the generic sleeve. And then you see it later in Chicago house music, although to a much less extent, where, say, a label like Trax Records had these kind of custom bags, but very few labels could afford to produce them. So it goes back to the white sleeve, where there's an almost absence of design.
But then obviously, in retrospect, all this becomes incredibly important.
Yeah.
And all the simple designs bring back a lot of memories of exactly what record that is, but also that period of design that was, in a sense, not exactly high style, but so down to earth for what it needed to be.
I think obviously in exhibitions like Art of Noise and the many books and anthologies on record sleeve design, the emphasis tends to be on professional graphic design, high
Right.
production values,
Yeah.
of course, which don't really exist anymore in the way that they did in the 70s and 80s. But when you get to dance music culture, it's really the absence of that.
It's a little more difficult. I mean, there were great albums. There was, especially when Grace Jones came around, her record label really had a sense that people needed to see her.
Right.
So her sleeves were amazing. Richard Bernstein, who did the covers for Interview in that period, did all the early Grace Jones sleeves. And so from the beginning, she was iconic. And they had that sense that they needed to do that.
And Paul and Barbie, how do you continue that tradition in your work as a label?
Yeah, I mean, our label's pretty young, and we're figuring it out as we go. And, we're learning a lot with every release. But ultimately, I wanted to show this one, which is a contemporary example of a fairly new label, Mother Tongue, out of Italy. And it's really just branding at its most purest, in its most purest sense. It's just repetition so that you recognize a certain aesthetic when you encounter it out in the busy world. And I find that this, whenever I walk into a store and I see this on the wall, I know there's a new yellow jacket out. And I think, that you can trace this back to the West End pink that you might also be looking for on a different timeline. Also Joe Classel's label as well, with the equation on the left and his mom down on the right. So we, pressing 12 inches is not easy in today. The margins are really low. Basically, it costs the same amount. It costs the same to make a 12 inch as it does an album, but you can't charge as much. 10 tracks on an album versus 2 to 4 on a 12 inch. So a lot of distributors are actually advising against it. But to us, the 12-inch format is really important. It's foundational to dance music culture, as we were discussing. And it's the people that are still playing vinyl are playing records are still super important to us to serve. So we just, you have that? Okay, cool. Mm-hmm. We just introduced a company jacket, which will be on our next sort of 4 or 5 12-inch releases. This is just the first. So the idea is to create this kind of consistency on the jacket itself, but then iterate on the hype sticker on the top right and sort of try and match the aesthetic or the sensibility to the music, as well as the inner label as well.
I think we went back and forth so much when we were designing it's one of the things that, you might have seen as a through line in a lot of these historic dance 12-inch jackets is it's just sort of they strike you from a distance. I think a lot of us who go to record stores, I would say there's a lot more there's in used record stores, but if you see a record on the wall, you recognize the West End pink, you recognize the South Soul rainbows. It became evident that what becomes a punchy, timeless thing. Because these 12 inches are timeless music, and because of the abundance of digital music today, you really think 2 to 3 times before you press a 12-inch, because like Paul mentioned, the numbers just simply don't really add up a lot of times. Creating something that you could just instantly see from a distance, or something that just became ownable and became sort of part of the DNA of what we do, is just, that's kind of where we landed on. While I was pulling records for the show and tell today, I actually went through, I have a little section of West End records in my shelves, and the hot pink just really sticks out. And I realized how much they iterated between the jackets. There's the kind of later stuff. One just says giant single, then the other one just says giant single 33 1/3. Where the stars shine, where are the stars? What's the phrase that it says again? I always forget. Where the sun sets and the stars shine is sometimes on the sleeves and sometimes it isn't. This is a fun. So, okay. But yeah, it's just kind of the jacket as an artifact. The jacket as something that is part of the tools that you use and part of the musical DNA. Now when I pick up a record by Prelude, I know what it sounds like. Right. And I don't necessarily, especially our work as DJs, I don't necessarily go to the shelf and look for the artist sleeve. I look for the jacket, right, for the company jacket, because that's the kind of thing that I'm after. I learned how to dig for records by learning about labels. And okay, so going to that. So a few years ago, we were working towards a sort of a weekend exhibition at Come Together, the record and label fair that MoMA PS1 was doing with other music. And they invited us at the time to do something. And we had recently struck up a relationship with the guys from Holy Ghost, who were recently signed to BMG Records, which owns the West End Records catalog. I know, just follow me there. And through that conversation, said, why don't we show, put something together about West End to celebrate West End Records and their legacy. And it was around that time that a binder was simply just presented to us. This person named Andy said, I used to work at West End in the later period, and I have a binder for you. Here are some materials. And so we got a chance to exhibit some of this. So what you're seeing right now is an alternative logo that was once sort of suggested by whoever came up with the West End logo.
Yeah, it could have been an interesting left turn that they might have taken in the 90s or early 2000s as the digital age kind of came. I don't think it ever saw the light of day, but yeah.
I'm glad it didn't stick because I don't think it has.
Vince, I think if you go upstairs or if you've had a chance to be upstairs. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just thinking, this is the obsessiveness of record collectors, which is in case you didn't notice.
But I think if you go upstairs, especially as it relates to dance music culture, there is an amazing series of vitrines with flyers from disco music culture, from early hip-hop music culture, from salsa culture.
Yeah.
And I was just curious, Vince, that in that period, in the beginning, late 60s, when the loft begins through the early 70s, we obviously when we think about disco, we tend to think about the kind of imagery that comes from mainstream sources like Saturday Night Fever. But was design a significant factor at that time in the way that the conversation circulated amongst people in terms of flyers, or was it much more low-key and underground? And
yeah, I can't really pin that down. I mean, it's an interesting way to think about it, and I don't remember, the flyers that I can remember were really very basic, not very design-oriented. But there's some good flyers upstairs, none of which I recognized. I just think there was, so much of it was handmade, which was, in a sense, an aesthetic in itself. And it didn't feel like, until things got very corporate and there were big labels interested in disco, it took a while for it to come up from underground and have an aesthetic, right. Which I think little by little, labels like Casablanca, it was, of course, very super sexy, super, just a lot of people dancing. And it became a little bit obsessive there too, but it didn't exactly get very classy right away. But I think that was, again, the aesthetic. It was really a little more than cheesy early on. And that, I think it had a lot to do with people kind of looking down at disco from the beginning, because it did kind of embrace this kind of super sexy way of looking at the dance floor.
because I think if you look upstairs, there's obviously the handwritten flyer from DJ Kool Herc's parties in the Bronx. Then there's a very simple postcard from the loft. And like you say, there isn't really a visual idea yet of the culture until much later.
Yeah, it was really, because a lot of that was just hand distributed or stuck up on a telephone pole, right. Stuck up on, somehow to advertise something that was happening that weekend.
And I think that, it's only when you start to see the emergence of like the first, a super club like Studio 54 that has a budget, they start to produce extraordinarily elaborate invitations for parties. To Paul and Barbie, I think one of the things that really struck me about the zine was, we touched on it before, is that you were working within a very specific legacy of underground publishing, of independent publishing, of sort of samizdat publishing. Is something lost in the digital era that the sort of documents and relics upstairs represent, that we now see a party pop up on our phone, we might click a like, or we might make a screenshot, but there is no paper trail in the way that there once was, and that is evidenced on this table.
No, I miss all that, obviously. I mean, not that I could house most of it at this point, but I mean, I would have brought a lot more stuff, except at one point I donated every disco record that I had to the Experience Music Project in Seattle. And then I sold every bit of ephemera that I had, every club invite, every flyer, everything. And I miss that. I miss all that material. Not that I could, again, house it anymore, but it was, for me, really important to have that visual representation of this life that I lived, of these places that I went to, of this long period where it hadn't really been turned into a business.
But just as you guys continue to release 12-inch records, vinyl records, the decision to publish Love Injection in print was clearly a very determined act, which was, even then, a decade ago, was working against the way culture was drifting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, for us, the internet at that time was feeling overwhelming and feeling saturated. That was 10 years ago now. It's like it's exponentially gotten way worse. And to your earlier question, like, we call this stuff ephemera, but in some ways, I think the digital artwork that we see every day, week to week, for those on the party circuit, is even more ephemeral because it just slides by in an instant, and maybe we don't go back to look at it. And also, in the way that today's album covers, digital album covers, don't house all the information they used to house, like the credits, the photographer information, where it was made, where it was pressed. We don't have all the information on those flyers. On the digital flyers, they tend to be simpler, I noticed, because of the reliance of the platforms by which they're shown. So a flyer might be shown and there's a caption underneath, so maybe you don't need to be redundant about that information on the flyer like some of these were. So I think that's changed things too. Like, short aside, like, one of my first jobs was working at a nightclub called Pasha, New York. It was open from 2005 to 2015, and high visibility was always what my boss sort of hammered about. Can it be seen from a distance? Are people, like drunk people leaving the club, going to be able to read it really quick and clock what it is to get a sense of if I should keep this or throw it away? And I think that new flyers, while they've been pushed to another level, some aren't legible. Some are more artistic than they are functional. Yeah. And I think that's just a function of, like, okay, it's going to be on the DICE ticket site where you're going to be able to get the vital info anyway, so it's not that critical.
Well, yeah, there's that. One thing that I always am trying to be careful and sort of catch myself. It's like, am I just like an old person yelling at the cloud? Like, I think that in our mid to late 30s, like, we are talking and sort of romanticizing this sort of tactile things. The internet is not just like a digital graveyard for everyone. I do think that there are people who collect screenshots, people who use their Instagram save folder as one would use like the shelf or the drawers or whatever. It's not necessarily my case, although I save other dumb stuff on the internet. But people, just because it is ephemeral in that it lives on the timeline, it doesn't mean that it's gone forever. I will say that I am always careful to remember that anything that does get posted on social media is also now owned by them. So even though, you might be promoting your party or whatever, ultimately, like, they now own the intellectual property that you worked hard for and what have you. So that's something to note in regards to the digital aspect of things. And let's just think about that. But, you know, as we started working on stuff together, be it flyers, parties, records, etc., I think, you know, you cannot ignore like the digital, sort of the current digital landscape, and you just have to kind of keep that into account. When we were doing our fundraisers in Magic City, which sort of was the birthplace of like our all-night parties, we were putting, you know, we were taping up stuff to flag poles and light poles, light posts, and like posters everywhere. We still put posters up for parties because ultimately, you know, there isn't a more focused like person than the person that is at the record store and wants to know what's going on, and like that is sort of the ground zero for attracting like-minded people, or places like the Lot Radio. So we still very much believe in printing stuff and keeping a digital, a physical paper trail, because when Meta goes away and somebody else takes over, then like they'll take all that stuff with them, and I don't know what you'll be left with.
Yeah, because I think a paradox of, you know, the digital culture is that it seems to have generated a parallel publishing culture. So, you know, there's probably this many books on rave flyers now. You know, I'm waiting for the Vermont rave flyers book to come, because it seems like no scene's too small to be not documented.
Yes.
And in a way, that's amazing, because like when we published, you know, the disco files with Vince, we published an edition of 100 copies because I thought that was the audience. And it took the guys at DJ History to realize that there was 10,000 people wanted to buy that book. So it seems to me that in this opening up, and then obviously the institution's interest in these histories, which includes, you know, where we are today, San Francisco Museum of Art, which originated this show, and also speaking to this morning's panel, the way that sound system culture has become of interest to cultural institutions. So Peter Doig just closed his exhibition in New York, which had an extraordinary sound system installed as part of the work. And obviously Devon has taken his sound system into galleries and museums too. So it seems to me we're at an interesting inflection point with the historicization of this culture, the visual culture that accompanied it, but also the kind of sort of social culture and narratives that go along. And it seems to me that that got touched upon in the sound system conversations. That's ultimately it's about community. Ultimately it's about the culture. And certainly, Vince, that was your experience in the 60s through the 70s. You were one of the people that founded the first record pool. And it seems to me that you collectively understood you were involved in something together. Is that true?
Yeah, very much. There was this really kind of a sense of community among the people who were playing records at that point, mostly because it was a relatively small number of people at the beginning, at least, and everybody knew each other, and everybody had these sort of meeting places like Vinyl Mania, all the record stores. People would run into each other as DJs, but also as people in their crowd. There was this sense of everyone kind of touching base and having a sense of this larger community. So I think that really had a lot to do with building that community, and having little by little a way to organize it, and a way to, especially the record pool, was a way to help DJs deal with record companies that at that point were not interested in them, didn't know how to deal with them at all. And so we provided a way for DJs to get records that they needed and promote records that the companies little by little realized was really important to them. So it was, at one hand, no, that's not the right, anyway, it really made a difference to have an organization that brought a lot of people together, and a sense of recognizing the power of that, the power of being played in a club that DJs, I think, certainly instinctively knew, because they could see people responding. But it took a while for the record companies to understand why these records were selling.
And it seems, Paul and Barbie, that sense of community persists. You know, we see it in the continuation of the loft parties. We see it in Joe Clausel's Cosmic Arts. We see it upstate with Dope Jams in the Catskills. And it seems to me that Love Injection, in all of its manifestations, is rooted in that notion too.
Yeah, for us, it's about participating and not just extracting. So much of dance culture essentially gave me the roadmap to how I've lived my adult life. So as soon as I got a good enough idea to figure out how I wanted to give back to it, I tried to. And I think if we all sort of think about how we can contribute more instead of just taking, in every aspect, you might be able to make a zine or make a record or help someone get a gig or help someone set up a party. I think that mindset is sort of pervasive in the places that we like to go, and some of the ones you mentioned are some of the best contemporary examples of that.
I think also I'm kind of drawing a parallel between what you're this specific era of what you're talking about, Vince, where like this sort of when disco became so big and it just became sort of this bastardization of what it initially had been, and I think basically what we're trying to hold on to, or trying to not hold on to, don't want to sound like too romantic, but trying to today, like dance music, the electronic dance music complex or whatever we want to call it, like it feels like we're back in 1979 again, and like something might just break. At least that's the way I see it. It's just this multi-million-dollar like industry, and so I always see ourselves as operating within a small sector of it, and trying to kind of keep true to like the values of the music and inhabiting the values of the community, and like living those principles, and having music be the connective tissue that kind of keeps us together, and that brings all these people from disparate parts of the world to kind of gather and like have a real experience together, if that makes sense.
Is there somebody paying attention to all that, like the way I was writing about disco week by week? Is there somebody writing about this larger scene? Besides, I mean, in a larger way.
Yeah.
It's really hard to know, like, how far does this expand?
It's huge. But I think, and maybe one of our gripes is that I feel like dance music journalism is really at a not so great point in its inception and its sort of path. I don't know. But I don't know how much I want to talk about it. It feels like a tangent I don't want to go into.
Yeah, it's a tension, but it's decentralized. I guess Resident Advisor is like the paper of record for the underground dance scene, but there's DJ Mag, there's Mix Mag. These are the kind of like the bigger names. There's also a bunch of Substacks and voices that are covering this from like a music perspective, from a cultural perspective, from a financial perspective. But I think to Barbie's point of 1979, which was the point where disco got so oversaturated and commercial that it eventually exploded and stopped getting support by the institutions, and it kind of went back underground. I think that's where we feel most comfortable, is this place that'll always be there, this sort of underground state.
Yeah.
Maybe in 25 years' time, somebody will be at someone's house and come across their Substack of writings on music and say, hey, can I publish that? Just like you had a real stack.
Yeah.
We're going to open it up to questions. And one of my takeaways from this afternoon's conversation is Paul, when he was working at Pasha, being asked to design for drunk people. And I think that's a book waiting to be made. I was just in the bookshop up here, and there's so many great books on different minutiae of design, but I think designing for drunk people would be a great book.
I have some pieces ready.
Wait, speaking of books, do you have the Dope from Hope that is around? So Paul and Barbie made a book called Dope from Hope, and there's probably some Clips speaker fans out here. They put this together a few years ago, and I'll let you explain it because you'll explain it much better than I do. But it's pretty cool.
Oh, it's a long-winded story. So
You got 30 seconds.
yeah, so when we were listening to some at David Mancuso's memorial, Colleen Cosmo Murphy mentioned that David loved to Xerox and share pages out of this, what we thought was a publication called Dope from Hope, which we shortly realized wasn't a book at all. It was a set of internal newsletters that Paul Klipsch, the founder of the Klipsch loudspeaker company, would write and distribute amongst his dealers and friends and people in the industry, because it actually sort of, as they were being written, it kind of tracked with the evolution of audio, of hi-fi. So there's a lot of interesting concepts in here. He's a good writer and he's super funny, so people really liked them. And some of the concepts that are in these pages, David used and distributed to his friends, like, for instance, the idea of a false corner, which the specific dimensions that they use at the loft come from Paul's recommendations, which kind of complete the Klipschhorn loudspeaker cabinet, because they're really meant to be in corners only. But when you're setting up parties, you don't always have those ideal conditions. So, that's just one of many, many, many examples. And so this inspired us to figure out where we could read the rest of the papers, because there were a few circulating on forums like Deep House Pages, etc. So through Colleen and her relationship with Klipsch, we got to go to the Klipsch Museum of Audio History in Hope, Arkansas, and find the archive. And we pitched them this book that we couldn't fund, so we suggested it should be a Kickstarter. And just from dancing in New York and around the world at parties set up by Klipsch lovers, we've kind of figured that it could work. And we were right. We were heartened by the community, literally from around the world, supporting the project, helping us get it off the ground. There are people in Barcelona that helped us with Facebook ads. There are people, people helped with design. People helped with boosting the message. And we were overfunded, and we made, how many books did we make?
1,651, I think.
Yeah, and it sold out in pre-order, and I can't imagine making this myself. So it's the only edition that'll exist for a good amount of time.
And we got a lot of help from Kickstarter as well. The team really got behind it, so shout out to them also. But yeah.
Okay, we will open it up now. Who would like to ask a question?
I'm curious if you guys each have a record where the artwork really has influenced how it sounds to you, like maybe even incongruously, if that makes sense.
It's a peculiar question. I'm trying to think of a record that I think of visually, but also really engages me musically, especially since so much of what I still relate to doesn't relate to record covers anymore. Let's give me a minute.
I have an example that's in the current exhibition upstairs on the third floor. There's an original Peter Saville designed screen printed poster for Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures. It's also the only thing I own that's in the exhibition. One sold recently for $5,000, so hang on to it. But when I bought that record in the summer of 1979, I was 14, and I hadn't encountered an object like that before. And then later, as I got to know Peter and more about it, what interested me even more is that Peter never listened to the music that he designed for. And you can see why his work's so interesting because of that, because he's not trying to illustrate something. He's not working to a brief from either the band or the label. He's really just doing his own thing. So he's responding to a kind of tone that he sort of picked up on from the people that he was working with. So for me, that's really important because it's so iconic and it's hard to separate that image,
Yeah.
which was given to him. He didn't even find the image. It was given to him by Bernard Sumner, I think. And then he sort of reversed it and turned it into one of the most iconic images in certainly music history and certainly in design history. So, but it's hard to separate it from the record because they seem so inextricably connected, but they're actually not connected at all in some way.
I feel like I'm trying to think of a specific record, but I actually think I'm more drawn to like identity systems. Like I keep thinking about CTI records. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but it's kind of a striking, like I love just kind of when a label has a design system and it's on the 12-inch sleeve. It just kind of has a thick white border around it. It's always really striking photography and just like text, and I think it's Helvetica back. It's like pretty simple. And I kind of became just obsessed with collecting CTI records, not just because I like them, but also like the object itself was so beautiful. And I know you have a history with like, Paula Scher's design and sleeves but I don't, like when preparing for the talk, I was like, is there like a record that I remember buying for the art? And I remember being like, I don't know that I ever was like sold the music because of the art that hard, but rather just sold, I liked the object because it's what it does to me, and then the music kind of lives separately for some reason, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the only thing that comes to mind, I'm sure there's a million, but Stevie Wonder Innovisions is so layered and complex. If you really stare at it as you're listening to the music and you look at the micro illustrations that are going on in the gatefold, it really enhances your experience listening to the record.
Or I think, sorry, I'm thinking about something else. Like dancehall records, like dancehall compilation records, like Steely and Clevie, like all those sort of early digi records as well. Like I keep thinking about eras and about records and visual styles as just like representatives of a scene or of a musical ecosystem, and the way that like you'll find like 90s house sleeves here to kind of feel a certain way, or in the way that just like design movements feel so cyclical. And I think that like kind of the post-punk movement follows that in a way, like Smith's records, Joy Division records, 4AD stuff as well kind of has its own identity. Yeah, it's less a specific record, but more just like moments and movements.
Do you think of anything, Vince?
So when I was working at Tower Records briefly, I was the buyer in the 12-inch single department. And a lot of times when I saw records, most of the time I didn't know what the record was. It was usually a new group, but all the new wave British records had great sleeves. And so that was, that still sort of sticks with me. All the sleeves from, New Order, obviously, but even, West End Girls, just there was a whole series that not all the performers lasted, but the sleeves really made an impression.
I think what also the exhibition represents is it's like a whole field of employment and job titles that largely don't exist anymore. Record companies had art departments filled with art directors and graphic designers and typographers and people who dealt with the image to production process. That's almost completely gone. So it also represents a kind of sort of, not just a different era, but a kind of entirely different idea of where design comes from, or who makes design, or what is design even.
And also like creating an image of an artist. I'm thinking of Grace Jones, but Laura Nyro. All her covers are so, they really cement her vision in your mind.
Okay, we have time for one more.
Hi. I was wondering, because I'm born in a digital age, so I'm pretty new to vinyls, and it's been a very fascinating experience. But I also thought that music being one of the few untangible mediums in this world that it's just sounds and frequencies that connect people. Yet it comes in so many of these tangible forms, such as vinyls, and having a collection of vinyl and a sense of possession of these vinyls. I thought that it's very interesting how the polar opposite of those aspects seems. And I was wondering if that ever come across your mind, and if you can speak to your perspective of that a little bit.
'Cause I love vinyl records. For the longest time, I had a whole room stocked with vinyl records. I could not sustain that. In the end, I had to use those shelves for other things. But I still have a lot of, I kept a lot of key vinyl records. And they do represent this history for me. Every Aretha Franklin album, every Madonna record, every Smokey Robinson record, all those things that I may never play again, but that I'll never get rid of.
I just recommend you all Google Vince Aletti's apartment. It's one of the most extraordinary spaces in New York City, and I hope one day it's preserved.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was also thinking about in the way that you collect specific artists, and that signals a memory from a certain time for you. For me, anytime I pull out a record, I could remember exactly where I bought it, where I was in the world, what was going on at that time, unless I bought it online, which you try not to do because then, you know. But for me, it's like pulling out a record I haven't played in a while and then having that experience of remembering my experience buying it is super important to me, or discovering it is super important to me.
I do want to also, not to be like that, but it's not just vinyl records. I mean, music exists in all incredible other forms of media, cassettes, like CDs. I think what I absolutely love about physical formats in general is just liner notes and context, and just being able to sit with something for a while, and just interact with it in another way than just what is happening in my ears and in my mind. Like when I made a record, I did an album once, and because the album was so personal and it came from a lot of like emotional sort of turmoil and eventually growth. I was journaling a lot at the time, and I felt it was really important not just to give people the album itself, but just to give them glimpses of my journal so that it could provide some greater context as to just why the music is the way it is, kind of simple and sometimes broody and sometimes like very emotional and naive. And I think that like in DSP, streamers, Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, etc., that stuff tends to really just get lost because art appears really small. I know they're making improvements to their platforms to add like greater detail to like album personnel, but it really is nowhere near the amount of detail and connection that we might be able to have with something that we're holding and reading and getting a deeper context into. So
Well, you did a whole show.
We did a show at White Columns probably a long time ago now, like 15 years ago, maybe more, called Sleeve Notes, which was just about writing for records, for record sleeves. So it was just examples of truly brilliant writing that just happened to have appeared on a record sleeve, not in a book or elsewhere. And to the best of my knowledge, an anthology of sleeve note writing doesn't exist. I could be wrong on that.
that's another book.
Another book, free idea for publishers and authors. But one thing I wanted to think about and say is really is that it speaks to the question about the idea of a record collection and what does it represent. I still think there's a real cultural deficit in terms of our understanding of what a record collection is. And I'm always amazed the historically significant or consequential record collections are broken up. So a really great example would be the act of cultural vandalism in the UK, where John Peel's family sold his record collection at different auctions, literally breaking up the most important record collection ever assembled in the United Kingdom. And it should have been in a museum, the Victorian Albert Museum. They should have just bought it. They could spend 20 years working out what to do with it, but it's gone for good now. And I think the same happens really regularly with DJs' collections, which, in my opinion, are as significant as the papers of any significant writer, which museums and libraries love to buy, but they don't have any interest whatsoever in a DJ's record collection. So Mancuso's record collection, what will happen to it? I'm sure someone knows. What will happen to, Danny Krivet's record collection? What will happen to Francois Kevorkian's record collection, and so on? And they need to be preserved because it's not a random collection of records. It's a very specific set of tools, materials, information that somebody used to create culture. But institutionally, there's zero interest in collecting this material.
I was really glad that I was able to donate my disco collection to the Experience Music Project. I don't even know what format they're in anymore. I think they changed their name, but I believe they still exist.
This was the Pop Cultural Museum in Seattle.
Started by Paul Allen. Anyway, but at the time I was thinking about it, I was told that the rock and roll
Hall of Fame?
yeah, in Cincinnati,
Yeah.
that they
Cleveland, right?
Cleveland, sorry, that that supposedly is the key for this sort of thing, that they weren't interested in collecting records, and it seemed really, couldn't understand that, because everyone has a collection that would identify that moment.
We could talk about this forever.
Yes, I think we signal we're out of time.
Yeah, we really could talk about it forever. And part of that and part of what we do here through the learning department at Cooper Hewitt is to continue talking about it between each other, with us, keep in touch. We have more programs coming up, and they are really opportunities for the community to get together, learn from one another, get inspired, and keep in touch. So if you want to find out more about other programs coming up, we have our website. We also have a newsletter called Design News. It comes out once or twice a month. And sometimes on social, we also post, but really the newsletter and the website are the best way to find out. We have more Art of Noise programs coming up along with other programs. You'll have to check it out, but we have an incredible exhibition by Christopher Payne of factories in the US. So please take a look at that. And so right now, what's going to happen is we have a little time to mingle in here. Check out the speakers. Mo, you're going to do maybe some effects with your device that I keep. What is the name of that? Dub siren, thank you.
Mo, you should have done that whilst we were speaking.
So we have a
Spice it
little
up.
time to hang out here. And also, please join me upstairs to see the exhibition if you haven't seen it already, and the listening room. Go check it out. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.